Right. Yeah, I want to remind you of where we've been and where we are, kind of situate what I'm doing. That's important that you hang on to where I am. So the first point in the historical case for the resurrection is that the disciples sincerely believed Jesus had been raised from the dead. They were completely convinced of that fact. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, we know it from several lines of evidence. The first of which is that the early disciples claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. They proclaimed that is what they believed, that this is the truth. They declared that to be the truth. And we know that early disciples claimed that Jesus rose from the dead because multiple early and independent sources make that clear. Specifically, we have Paul's letters, we have the four Gospels, we have the sermons and the speeches in Acts, we have other New Testament writings, we have the letters of Clement and Polycarp. And in addition to the fact that the early disciples proclaimed that Jesus was raised from the dead, we know they sincerely believed that it happened because there's overwhelming evidence of the kind of things one would expect to see if that is what they believed. There's overwhelming evidence. In other words, we see the effects one would expect such a belief to produce. If it's true, they say, this is what happened, this is the truth, we believe this. Now, if they believe that, you would expect that belief to have certain manifestations. It would create certain effects. And we have overwhelming evidence of those kinds of effects, which confirms that they genuinely believe this. And I'm now discussing those effects. And last week I spoke about Paul's change of life, his reversal. James's change of life, his reversal. I mentioned that the disciples continued to believe in Jesus as Messiah after his crucifixion, after he's dead. Whereas all of these other movements, when the leader was killed, that was it. We thought this, but now he's dead. Obviously he's not. He's not the Messiah. But these guys, what happened? They continued to proclaim he was the Messiah after he'd been crucified. And the early Christians, the next thing in the facts and circumstances that confirm the sincerity of their belief is the early Christians, they modified the Jewish beliefs in the resurrection in the kinds of ways you would expect them to modify those beliefs if Jesus had been raised from the dead, if they were convinced of that. You see that specifically, there are 7 major modifications of Jewish understanding of resurrection that became central within Christianity in the first 2 centuries, all of which flow naturally from a conviction that Jesus had been raised. First, you have that despite coming from all strands of Judaism, you had these different Jewish beliefs in the afterlife. Despite coming from all strands of Judaism and from differing backgrounds within paganism, and you had these differing beliefs about the afterlife within paganism, early Christians were virtually unanimous in believing in a resurrection after death. In other words, there wasn't the diversity of view that you would expect from a group of people who had been drawn from Judaism and paganism that had these differing beliefs. Now, all of a sudden in Christianity, you're down to one belief about the afterlife. It's now down to belief in a resurrection, and something caused virtually all Christians to embrace one view about the afterlife from this smorgasbord of views in the pagan and Jewish world that I talked about in the introduction. So it's what happened? You're drawing from the Jewish world and the pagan world. They're coming to Christ, but when they do, they all now have one view of the afterlife. Resurrection. Well, that's the kind of thing you would expect if they were convinced that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And in Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of the first century, resurrection was important, but it wasn't a central matter of faith. Whereas in Christianity, resurrection moved from the circumference to the center. We now have it in the center. As N.T. Wright says, he says, take away the stories of Jesus' birth, and you lose only 2 chapters of Matthew and 2 of Luke. Take away the resurrection, and you lose the entire New Testament and most of the second century fathers as well. So it moves in Christianity, the resurrection beliefs of Judaism move from the perimeter to being central to the faith. And then we see, thirdly, you have this, the early Christian belief about resurrection. It sharpened the rather vague view, Jewish view, about the nature of the resurrection body. So there wasn't a lot of development about that in Jewish thinking. But from the start, Christians believed that the resurrection body would be a body that had been transformed to have new properties. Though physical, it would in some sense be supernatural, having properties of power, imperishability, and incorruptibility. Paul sets that out clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, a mere 25 years after the Lord's resurrection. And you can also look at Philippians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. And then you have these modifications of Jewish belief. The fourth Christian mutation of Jewish thinking about resurrection, about the afterlife, is that the end-time resurrection that the Jews accepted, that end-time resurrection as an event, it has in Christian theology split into 2. This is what Wright says about that. I've explained this, but here Wright says, no first century Jew prior to Easter, prior to Christ's resurrection, no first century Jew prior to Easter expected the resurrection to be anything other than a large-scale event happening to all God's people, or perhaps to the entire human race, as part of the sudden event in which God's kingdom would finally come on earth as in heaven. There is no suggestion that one person would rise from the dead in advance of all the rest. That resurrection life, resurrection to immortal life, would begin in an individual within history. It would happen at the end. And yet, that's not what happens in Christianity. That belief has changed. He says the exceptions sometimes noted, Enoch and Elijah, do not count precisely because they were held not to have died, and so resurrection, new life after bodily death, would not be relevant. And B, they were in heaven, not in a new body on earth. Now, some other first century Jewish movements, they did believe that the end had already, in some sense, begun. But as Wright points out, he says, we never find outside Christianity what becomes a central feature within it. The belief that the mode of this inauguration consisted in the resurrection itself happening to one person in the middle of history in advance of its great final occurrence, anticipating and guaranteeing the final resurrection of God's people at the end of history. So we're looking at these alterations of Jewish understandings and views about resurrection that flow out of the early Christians' conviction that Jesus had in fact been raised from the dead. And the fifth mutation is that of the Jewish belief. It springs from the early Christian conviction that the great final resurrection of the last day, that it had already begun, or had already been inaugurated in the resurrection of Christ. And the thinking is that because God's future had in some sense already arrived in the present, that the not yet had been pulled into the now in the resurrection of Christ, they believed it was their responsibility to work in the power of the Spirit toward transforming the present as far as they were able in the direction of the eternal state. In other words, they believed they were to anticipate the consummation, the final resurrection and remaking of the world by working through God's power to transform the present consistently with that eternal vision. So here we are, that the end has already begun, and so our role here is to be this aroma and to be a transforming influence in the direction of the eschaton, the eternal state, that perfect reality. We are to work to be agents at work here in this world. This is how they saw that. And that flows out of this conviction that Jesus was resurrected in history. That the resurrection has already started. And then 6, the early Christians, they changed the Jewish metaphorical use of resurrection. They changed the metaphorical use of resurrection. Rather than functioning as a metaphor for the Jewish return from exile, the renewal of ethnic Israel, resurrection in Christianity, it functioned as a metaphor for baptism and the new life of strenuous ethical obedience. So you have a shift in the metaphorical usage. And that flows out of this conviction of Jesus being resurrected. It's no longer just the nation of Israel coming out. You have this other idea. And then the last modification of resurrection belief within the Christian faith, how they modified the Jewish view of it, was the association of the concept of resurrection with the Messiah. You see, despite the hints, you had hints in the Old Testament which became clearer. Those hints sharpened, and we could see them more clearly in light of Christ's resurrection. But despite the fact you had hints there, nobody in Judaism expected the Messiah to die. And thus nobody expected the Messiah to rise from the dead. And here's what Wright says, N.T. Wright. He says, where messianic speculations existed in first century Judaism, the Messiah was supposed to fight God's victorious battle against the wicked pagans, to rebuild or cleanse the temple, and to bring God's justice to the world. No Jew with any idea of how the language of Messiahship worked could have possibly imagined after his crucifixion that Jesus of Nazareth was indeed the Lord's anointed. But from very early on, as witnessed by what may be pre-Pauline fragments of early creedal belief, the Christians affirmed that Jesus was indeed the Messiah precisely because of his resurrection. See, so they then saw in his resurrection and went back and saw those Old Testament texts and said, oh, he's the Messiah. That wasn't there before. So here you see these kinds of things that flowing out of this conviction of who Jesus is, of the resurrection, that you see alterations, mutations, modifications of Jewish understanding of resurrection, the kinds of things you would anticipate and expect if in fact they believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. So it's another reinforcement of that. And then we have in this these facts and circumstances that I'm running through. Paul's reversal, James' reversal. They continue to believe. Early Christians modified Jewish belief in the resurrection. And you see that Christ's tomb wasn't venerated. Now, Jewish tombs, especially those of martyrs, they were venerated and often became shrines. And there's absolutely no indication of any of that happening with Jesus' grave. And that's precisely what you'd expect if the early disciples were convinced he'd been resurrected. That wouldn't be the focus of it. Now, the interest that was taken centuries later, during Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, when he began to build a church over the site of the resurrection, it wasn't because it was a site of his death, it was a site of his resurrection. You see, over his tomb. That's what they're doing. So that wasn't, it wasn't to say, well, we're turning his place of his death, his tomb, into a shrine. We're turning the place of his resurrection into a shrine. But that was many centuries later. And then we have the early church emphasized the first day of the week as their special day. They emphasize that. Now, that's very hard to explain unless something striking happened on that particular day. What's up with the first day of the week? Why all of a sudden does that become a crucial day, an important day, a significant day for Christians? Something must have happened. If the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead on that day, as they tell us, well, then that would explain why Sunday, why the Lord's Day. How has that now become a significant, important day? Because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, so that then confirms, again, the sincerity of this belief. And then we see finally the disciples were willing to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They were willing to suffer for that belief, and they wouldn't have done that. Right? They wouldn't have done that unless they sincerely believed he had been raised. Okay? People will do a lot of things. You can say, well, somebody will say something they don't believe if it's to their advantage and all that. But when it gets down to me suffering because of my belief, if it's a sham, if I don't really believe it, if I'm not sincere, as soon as they start whipping me, okay, I'm out. You see, I'm going to say, I'm not going to endure that for a goof. And yet you look how these guys suffered. And they suffered greatly. Paul tells us firsthand about some of the persecution that he endured, which treatment is, the things that he endured, some of it's corroborated by Luke. So we don't just have Paul out of the horse's mouth telling us. We have other things being corroborated. And we also see that Luke reports that Peter and John were imprisoned. The apostles were arrested, imprisoned, and flogged. Okay, you just say, okay, I get it. We're not going to say anything else about this because, we thought we were just pressing this to see what we could get out of it. We don't really believe it. It's not really true. All right, I'm quitting. They didn't do that. You see, James, the brother of John, was killed. And Peter was imprisoned, you see in Acts 12. And Luke makes clear that the resurrection of Christ was their central message. You see, for example, in Acts chapter 4, verse 2, Acts chapter 4, verse 33, they're coming telling these people, the guy you killed, God raised him from the dead and exalted him to his right hand. So the one you killed, God has reversed your judgment and said you were absolutely wrong. He is my anointed one. That's what they hated. That's what they meant when they say you're determined to put this guy's blood on us. What do you mean by that? Well, obviously they had the hand in executing him. They were the instigators of his execution. But by putting his blood on them means you are making us guilty. You are making our role in having him killed culpable. And it is culpable because God showed he was the Holy One. He did not deserve what you did to him. So you were unrighteous in doing that. You were guilty. That's how they put his blood on them. So this was their message. This isn't some incidental thing. This was their message, what they were preaching. Now, I've already mentioned the martyrdom of James, the Lord's brother, which is mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus, writing around AD 95, mentioned by the Christian Greek writer Hegesippus around AD 170, and Clement of Alexandria, writing around AD 200, and Clement in his letter to the church in Corinth, that letter that he wrote from Rome to the church in Corinth around AD 95, he reported the suffering of Peter and Paul, and probably also referred to their executions. That point is disputed. Polycarp, in his letter to the church in Philippi, that's dated between AD 110 and 117, he refers to the suffering of Paul and the other apostles. Tertullian, who wrote around AD 200, he reports the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul by Emperor Nero. And he says that information about the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, that it was available in the Roman public records. Around AD 200, he's saying you can go and find the evidence of their martyrdom in the Roman public records in the lives of the Caesars. And Origen, who wrote in the first half of the 3rd century, he tells about how the disciples suffered because they'd been convinced so thoroughly of the Lord's resurrection. And he reports that Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome under Nero. So here you have these guys who are just suffering horribly because of their conviction that they will not sell out. They will not come off of it. And they could relieve themselves of the suffering if they would simply recant. If they would say, listen, no, we made it up. It was just a joke. They wouldn't do it. Now, you tell me they didn't sincerely believe that. Of course they sincerely believe that. So here's what, when you look at that driving at this point, I've been all this time driving at this point, that they were convinced of this down to in the depths of their being, that this was true, that this had happened. They claimed it. Facts and circumstances confirm it. And this evidence that the disciples sincerely believed he'd been raised from the dead, this multiple, early, and independent sources that they believed it and proclaimed it, and these numerous facts and circumstances that confirm it, you have all of that. So it's so powerful. This evidence that I've outlined for you is so powerful that virtually all scholars, across the waterfront, I'm not talking about people in the churches of Christ. I'm not talking about evangelicals. I'm talking about virtually all scholars across the waterfront, except as a fact that the earliest Christians at least believed. They believed that they had encountered the resurrected Christ. And that's what I'm trying to get you to understand how powerful that is. Gary Habermas, who is a professor at Liberty University, specializes in Christian apologetics and more specifically with the resurrection of Christ. He wrote in an article published in 2001, he said, perhaps more firmly than ever, the vast majority of contemporary scholars are agreed that the earliest followers of Jesus at least believed that they had experienced their risen Lord. Even radical scholars rarely question this fact. It may well be one of the 2 or 3 most widely established particulars about Jesus' life. In an article he wrote in 2005, Habermas says, as we have mentioned throughout, there are certainly disagreements about the nature of the experiences, but it is still crucial that the nearly unanimous consent of critical scholars, is that in some sense, the early followers of Jesus thought that they had seen the risen Jesus. And in support of that assertion, he cites his book, The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, where he provides a list. He provides a list of more than 50 recent critical scholars who affirm these resurrection experiences as historical events. That when you're going at this from a standpoint of history, it is obvious from the things I've laid out to you that these guys were convinced of this, that Jesus had appeared to him. 1965, Reginald H. Fuller remarked in his book, The Foundations of New Testament Christology, that the disciples' belief that Jesus was raised from the dead, quote, is one of the indisputable facts of history, end quote. That they had experiences they thought were appearances of the risen Lord is, in Fuller's words, quote, a fact upon which both believer and unbeliever may agree. James D.G. Dunn, he was an internationally respected New Testament scholar, died last year. James Dunn says, it is almost impossible to dispute that at the historical roots of Christianity lie some visionary experiences of the first Christians who understood them as appearances of Jesus raised by God from the dead. We say, well, we're going to look at the historical case. First thing I want you to see, when we look historically, We look at the historical evidence. What does historical evidence tell us? The historical evidence tells us indisputably that these people were convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead. They were certain of that. Dunn adds, he says, by resurrection, they clearly meant that something had happened to Jesus himself. God had raised him, not merely reassured them he was alive again. And in his 1993 book, E.P. Sanders, they called the book's The Historical Figure of Jesus. E.P. Sanders included among a list of, quote, secure facts, end quote, that, quote, are almost beyond dispute, end quote, that after Jesus' death, his disciples saw him. Makes me look down here. And then in an epilogue, he writes this in an epilogue. He says that Jesus' followers, and Sanders is just a very well-known scholar. He says that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to those experiences, I don't know. So he's saying, look, there's one thing I can't get around it. These guys experienced something that made them certain that Jesus was risen from the dead. Jesus had come out of the tomb. 1995, the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, he concluded it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. In 1999, the New Testament scholar A.J.M. Wedderburn, he declared in his book, Beyond Resurrection, he said, it is an indubitable historical datum that sometime, somehow, the disciples came to believe they had seen the risen Jesus. They were certain. Something made them believe that. They became certain of that. In 2000, Paula Fredrickson, who's a Boston University historian, she is a Christian skeptic, but she said, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historical evidence we have afterward attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. Amen. They must have seen something. Then in 2014, Bart Ehrman, a New Testament scholar who describes himself as agnostic or atheist. He kind of blends them together. But he writes in his book, How Jesus Became God, Bart Ehrman says, there can be no doubt historically that some of Jesus' followers came to believe he was raised from the dead. No doubt whatsoever. This is how Christianity started. If no one had thought Jesus had been raised, he would have been lost in the midst of Jewish antiquity and would be known today only as another failed Jewish prophet. But Jesus' followers, or at least some of them, came to believe that God had done a great miracle and restored Jesus to life. This was not a mere resuscitation, a kind of near-death experience. For Jesus' disciples, Jesus was raised into an immortal body and exalted to heaven, where he currently lives and reigns with God Almighty. So you have him, this atheist guy. So, all this time I've been driving at this conclusion. I want you to see the power, the strength, the historical fact. If you speak this way of anything historically, you can speak this way about this. And that is that the disciples sincerely believed Jesus had been raised from the dead. We see it from the fact they claimed it, the confirming facts and circumstances, and that fact is acknowledged by virtually all scholars. Okay? So, they did that. Now, what's the deal? The crucial question, that having shown that, that's a fact, put to bed, okay? That's what they believed. How did that happen? Okay, we're no longer going to argue about that because I've spent weeks explaining why they truly, sincerely, genuinely believe that. Now, how did that happen? How did a group of people come to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead? How did they come to be so certain of that they would endure what they endured? What could have produced such a deep conviction? And in assessing that question, it's helpful to recognize that many people in the ancient world, many people there accepted that the spirits of recently deceased people might manifest themselves in some way to the living. But they did not confuse that with resurrection, with the return to bodily life. No one accepted or expected resurrection, at least not prior to that great last day when God judged and remade the world. And before you smirk at those ancients for believing that spirits of recently departed people, that they might appear in some manner or form, know that people have experienced such things in all cultures throughout the ages. In the mid-1950s, an editor of a Swiss magazine invited its readers to share such experiences, to report such experiences. And he received an astonishing 1,200 letters reporting 1,500 accounts of paranormal phenomena related to the dead and dying. And those letters to that editor became the subject of psychologist Aniela Jaffe's classic study, An Archetypal Approach to Death, Dreams, and Ghosts. That was published in 1979. And Jaffe says in that book, what the letters have to tell can be found in the oldest traditions. Experiences in which a dying person announces his presence by knocking, footsteps, the breaking of crockery or a ticking in the wall, the motif of premonition or precognition, prophetic dreams, haunting or actual apparitions, etc., have been handed down from time immemorial in every part of the world and have survived in primitive as well as in highly civilized cultures, regardless of rational objections and criticisms. So whatever psychological explanation one gives to those phenomena, however you think about those things, whatever psychological explanation you give to them, there's no question that throughout recorded history, such things have been believed to occur. You say, well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, the point is that the more this is accepted, the more this kind of thing is accepted, as was true in the ancient world, then the less likely people are to interpret a post-death encounter as a resurrection. You see, if we're kind of comfortable with the idea that the spirits of the recently departed may manifest themselves in some ways, but that's different from resurrection, well, then I'm not likely to take those things and turn them into resurrection. I have an alternative category for the experience already. You see, I have a category for that. So I'm not going to just leap to the idea, well, wait a minute, it's a resurrection. Here's what Wright says about it. He says, however, precisely because such encounters were reasonably well known, they could not possibly by themselves have given rise to the belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They are a thoroughly insufficient condition for the early Christian belief. The more normal these visions were, the less chance there is that anyone, no matter how cognitively dissonant they may have been feeling, would have said that what nobody had ever said about such a dead person before, that they'd been raised from the dead. You see, that's not what's happening. This idea of an apparition, these visitations, that's not resurrection. He says, indeed, such visions meant precisely as people in the ancient and modern worlds have discovered that the person was dead, not that they were alive. That's what that would be taken as. That's an indication. It's a visitation or some kind of thing like that. That's not resurrection. These people are convinced he was raised from the dead. That's a different kettle of fish altogether. Now, in that light, in order for the apostles to believe that Jesus was resurrected, they would have to be convinced that they had seen him in person. I've got this other category of spiritual things that is not resurrection. But they're saying he was raised from the dead. We're not talking about those things. We're talking about a resurrection. Now, for them to be convinced of that, they would have had to have been convinced that Jesus appeared to them in person, that he had been present with them bodily. You see, anything less would be attributed to the kind of non-resurrection, ghostly visitations or hallucinations that were understood to occur. So he had to be there. He had to be there, present with them bodily. Indeed, the resistance to resurrection was so strong that Thomas is reported to have demanded proof that the body before him was the same body that had been crucified. He says, "Look, you're not running a game on me. You're telling me the dead guy came back to life?" Nah, that doesn't happen. So I'm thinking somebody's doing something. Somebody's doing a prank, whatever you want to call it. Somebody's doing, and so that's not how. I want to see that this body is the body that was crucified. That's what I want to see. Okay. You know how that story goes. But you see the resistance to it. It says, "Unless I see in his hands the marks of the nails and place my finger into the mark of the nails and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Because I will believe something is happening, even if I can't explain it, that you guys are some kind of goof or something like that going on. But he says, I have to have that. So there was great resistance. But even if the apostles were convinced, okay, so the first thing, they would have to be convinced that Jesus had appeared to them in person, that he had been present with them bodily. But even if the apostles were convinced they had seen Jesus in person, that they had encountered Jesus bodily, they wouldn't conclude he'd been resurrected if his corpse was still in the tomb. You see, they wouldn't be convinced of that. His corpse would be proof positive that he was still dead, no matter what they had experienced. Right? They'd say, well, maybe an angel had shown up in the appearance of Jesus. Right? If I'm sitting here and I'm interacting with Jesus, he's here physically present with me, and I go and I see, no, he's still in the tomb dead, what am I going to do? I'm going to think, well, obviously, he's still dead. So there's some other explanation. For an example, the angel in the appearance of Jesus. So what they would have to have, we know they believe this. We know they were certain that Jesus had been raised from the dead. For them to have that conviction breaks down then into sub-convictions. They would have necessarily had to believe and to be certain that they had encountered Jesus personally, they had encountered Jesus bodily, and that the tomb was empty. It would take both of those things for them to conclude with conviction Jesus was raised from the dead. It would take both of those things for them to do it. So being convinced of that, that's what it requires. Here's what Wright says about this idea of them having to see if the corpse was in the tomb, what that would do to them. He says, even if several such experiences had occurred, if the tomb was still occupied by the dead body, they would have said to themselves after the experiences had ceased, we've seen exceedingly strange visions, but hey, he's still dead and buried, right? I mean, that's QED. He's dead. Right there. And so that's why I say you would have to have both of these things. So being convinced of that would require both of those. Now, given that the Jews did not expect that the resurrection would begin, all right, here's what I was telling you. Belief was resurrected means that I've already shown, everybody agrees, they came to that belief. Now, to have that belief, that means that they believed with conviction the tomb was empty and that Jesus had appeared to them bodily. So they had both of those things going on. You see, that were required. So being convinced they encountered Jesus bodily wouldn't be sufficient to convince them that he'd been raised from the dead. It would lead to that conclusion only if the tomb was empty. And likewise, being convinced the tomb was empty wouldn't be sufficient to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead. If they came and just saw the empty tomb, well, what would they think? They would think that somebody had stolen the body, whether it was enemies or somebody else. They would think that, right? I mean, otherwise, with Mary Magdalene in John 22, they would have assumed the body had been taken, whether by grave robbers, enemies, or whatever it was. So you need both of those things. If you have just believed that if the tomb being empty, that's not enough. I'd have alternate explanations. If Jesus appeared to them bodily, if he's still in the tomb, that's not enough. I have to have both. I have to have both of those convictions, and that's important. Now, given that the Jews didn't expect the resurrection to begin with an individual while the world continued on as it was within history, and given that prior alleged messiahs who were executed, they all stayed dead, the disciples were not expecting Jesus to return to life. They had no expectation. Sometimes people say, well, no, they had no expectation of that at all. That wasn't part of the Jewish landscape, theological landscape. And they had other examples of leaders who had been killed, and they all stayed dead. As Wright says, he said, had the tomb been empty with no other unusual occurrences, no one would have said that Jesus was the Messiah or the Lord of the world. No one would have imagined that the kingdom had been inaugurated. No one in particular would have developed so quickly and consistently a radical and reshaped version of the Jewish hope for the resurrection of the body. The empty tomb is by itself insufficient to account for the subsequent evidence. That's what I'm telling you. You have to have both of these convictions that flow out of that. So given that they are convinced of this, as we've shown, they have to have both. You say, well, then, all right, then the inquiry boils down to then, we know they believe that. We know then that means that they were convinced that Jesus had appeared to them bodily. You're going to have to hang on a second. Jesus had appeared to them bodily and that the tomb was empty. And you say, okay, so we know that they believe those things. Now, is there any indication of how they could have come to believe those? We can be sure they believed those because we know they were convinced he was resurrected. To be convinced he was resurrected required them to be convinced the empty tomb and bodily appearance. But can we go beyond that? Can we say, is there any historical evidence that would help us understand how did they come to believe that Jesus had appeared to them bodily? How did they come to believe that the tomb was empty? Do we have any shreds of evidence on that? Oh, we do. We do. And if I'm still alive next week, I'll come back.